The rift opened without ceremony at 22:30, a tear in the fabric of space above the Hudson River that made no sound, except the displacement of air. For 3 seconds, the anomaly hung suspended against the night sky like a wound, in reality itself edges flickering with energies that had no name in this universe. Then, something fell through. Nolan Grayson struck the North River power plant dam at terminal velocity. The impact registered on seismographs as far south as Philadelphia. Concrete exploded outward in a cone of destruction that reached 130 feet into the air, carrying with it hundreds of tons of water and the fragmented remains of the dam's eastern support structure. The shockwave moved through the surrounding industrial complex at the speed of sound, shattering every window within half a mile and throwing workers from their feet like scattered toys. The screaming started immediately. A maintenance worker near the turbine room had time for 3 words before debris ended him. "What the fuck?" Workers died in the first microsecond, bodies pulverized by the pressure wave before nervous systems could register pain. More followed within seconds as debris tore through the maintenance building with the force of artillery shells. Someone was shouting into a radio voice, climbing toward a hysteria. "Explosion at the dam. We need Jesus Christ. The whole structure is..." The transmission cut off as the building collapsed. A hydraulic turbine ripped from its moorings, carved through a shipping container, and continued another 300 feet before embedding itself in the parking lot. The figure that rose from the crater was untouched. Water cascaded off broad shoulders and a red cape that hung motionless despite the chaos of falling debris. The white and crimson costume bore no mark of the descent, no tear or scuff to suggest the violence of arrival. Blue eyes surveyed the destruction with the clinical detachment of a general inspecting a battlefield. Nolan took inventory of his situation with the efficiency of a warrior who had crossed 1,000 worlds. The planet's gravity felt standard. The atmosphere carried the chemical signatures of industrial pollution and organic decay. The architecture suggested a civilization in its technological adolescence, crude metal, and poured stone rather than adaptive materials or quantum-stable structures. Nothing about this world warranted further investigation. The sound of rotors cut through the settling dust. 2 helicopters appeared from the south, military-grade aircraft with mounted weaponry and searchlights that converged on the crater. A voice crackled through external speakers, amplified across the destruction. "Unidentified subject. Identify yourself immediately. This is your only warning." Nolan understood the intent perfectly. Languages differed, but authority always sounded the same. He waited. The helicopters circled once. The pilot's voice returned tighter now, fear bleeding through the professional tone. "Subject is non-responsive. Authorization to engage. Static, then a different voice from command. Weapons free. Take it down." The 20mm rounds tore through the space, where a normal being would have been shredded into component atoms. The ammunition struck Viltrumite flesh and stopped kinetic energy dissipating into heat that Nolan barely registered as warmth against his skin. Spent casings rained down around him, still smoking. He watched them fall with the mild interest of someone observing an insect trying to sting through armor plating. The guns fell silent. Radio chatter erupted from the lead helicopter, panic overwhelming training. "Shots ineffective. Repeat, all shots ineffective. Target is undamaged. Pull back now." The aircraft banked hard, rotors screaming as the pilot tried to gain distance. Nolan moved. The distance closed in a fraction of a heartbeat. One moment he stood in the crater, the next his hand had passed through the helicopter's tail rotor assembly. Metal screamed as the entire rear section separated from the fuselage, the physics of rotational force turning the aircraft into a tumbling coffin. The pilot never had time to scream. The machine struck the ground and erupted in a fireball that lit the industrial complex like a miniature sun. The second helicopter attempted evasive maneuvers, banking so hard the frame groaned under the stress. Nolan caught it at the apex of its turn hands, finding purchase on the landing struts. He pulled down with the casual force of someone closing a drawer. The helicopter folded around the point of contact nose and tail, meeting in a catastrophic compression that reduced sophisticated machinery to compacted scrap. Bodies still strapped into their seats experienced death by deceleration organs rupturing as velocity met a movable force. Nolan released the wreckage and let it tumble into the river. Fire reflected off the water's surface, painting the scene in shades of orange and red. Around the perimeter, survivors scrambled away from the crater with the universal instinct of prey, recognizing an apex predator. He let them run. They were irrelevant. This world was weak. The weapons were primitive projectile technology that would barely scratch a Thraxan combat armor, let alone Viltrumite physiology. The response time suggested no orbital defense network, no energy barriers, no quantum displacement fields. The military force employed conventional aircraft that moved at subsonic speeds. Everything about this civilization screamed vulnerability, a species playing at warfare with toys. But that assessment raised questions. Nolan could feel the dimensional instability that had pulled him through the anomaly, the residual energies that suggested this wasn't a natural occurrence. Someone or something had capability beyond what these weapons demonstrated. That disconnect demanded investigation before judgment. He lifted into the air with a thought the flight itself as natural as breathing. The industrial complex fell away beneath him, growing smaller until it became just another cluster of lights in the darkness. Below, emergency vehicles converged on the dam, with sirens that sounded like the dying screams of small animals. Above, the city proper spread out in a grid of illumination that stretched to every horizon. Nolan oriented himself toward the densest concentration of structures where buildings clawed at the sky in a display of architectural ambition that outpaced engineering sense. Cities always revealed the truth about civilizations. The way they built what they built, where they placed resources. All of it told a story about values and capabilities and weaknesses. This world would tell him its secrets whether it wanted to or not. Behind him, the North River power plant burned smoke rising into the night sky like a funeral pyre for the illusion of safety this world's inhabitants had cherished. Dozens lay dead or dying. More would follow from injuries and structural collapses, and the economic damage would ripple through supply chains for months. None of it registered as significant. Nolan had seen civilizations rise and fall across millennia. This was barely a footnote, the opening sentence of a story this world didn't yet know it was living. The rift that had brought him here had already sealed dimensional energies collapsing back into quantum foam as the universe corrected the violation of its laws. He was trapped here at least temporarily until the anomaly repeated, or he found whatever technology had caused it. That meant time to assess, to understand, to determine if this world represented a threat to Viltrum's interests or simply another primitive culture stumbling toward eventual irrelevance. Manhattan rose before him, a monument to human ambition, rendered in glass and steel, and Nolan flew toward it with the unhurried certainty of a predator who knew the prey could not escape. The hunt had begun. Manhattan at night resembled a shrine to manufactured divinity. Nolan descended through layers of light pollution that turned the sky orange, passing between towers of glass and steel that reflected his passage in 1,000 fragmented images. The city breathed with the rhythm of 8 million lives, each one contributing to the noise and heat and electromagnetic chaos that defined human civilization at this developmental stage. He slowed his flight to subsonic speeds, drifting through the canyons of Midtown with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a primitive culture. The buildings here reached impressive heights for a species working with pre-nanomaterial construction. But they lacked elegance. Every structure screamed desperation to prove something, to reach higher than necessity demanded, as if altitude alone could compensate for fundamental inadequacy. Times Square opened before him like a wound of pure commercialism. Electronic billboards covered every surface, each one competing for attention with brightness that could be seen from orbit. The displays cycled through advertisements and news feeds and entertainment promotions with the frantic energy of a species addicted to constant stimulation. And dominating it all, repeated across a dozen screens in variations of the same pose, was a figure in red, white, and blue. The man on the billboards stood with arms crossed, cape billowing in artificial wind chin, raised at an angle that suggested he'd practiced the pose until muscle memory made it automatic. The costume bore superficial resemblance to heroic archetypes Nolan had seen across 100 worlds. But something about the presentation felt hollow. This wasn't a warrior advertising capability. This was a product being sold to consumers who couldn't distinguish between genuine power and theatrical performance. Below him, a group of teenagers clustered around a merchandise stand, their voices carrying easily to his enhanced hearing. "Dude, Homelander could totally take on a whole fucking army," one insisted, gesturing at a poster. "He's never even been hurt." "Bro, A trains faster, though," another argued. "Speed beats strength every time. That's just physics. You're both idiots." Maeve would destroy either of them in a real fight. Nolan drifted lower, observing more clusters of civilians engaged in similar debates. A couple posed for photographs in front of a massive Homelander display, the woman adjusting her stance to mimic his crossed arms pose while her partner captured the moment. "Make sure you get the whole thing," she said. "I want everyone to see we were here when the statue lighting happened." A massive screen to his left transitioned to what appeared to be live news coverage. The anchor's voice boomed across the square with practiced enthusiasm. "Breaking news tonight as Homelander rescues a family of 4 from a 6-car pileup on the George Washington Bridge. Eyewitnesses report the hero arrived within minutes of the accident." The footage showed Homelander pulling civilians from twisted metal, pausing strategically between rescues to face the cameras. Each motion looked choreographed for maximum visual impact. The editing was seamless, removing any moment of genuine struggle or effort. The anchor continued. In other news, A-Train's new line of performance athletic wear dropped today, selling out in major markets within hours. Another screen showed different footage, this one featuring a figure in dark colors running through city streets. The graphic identified him as A-Train, and text scrolled beneath claiming speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. Nolan estimated the actual velocity at perhaps half that, but the discrepancy apparently didn't concern the audience watching below. "I'm getting those shoes," a young man said to his companion, pointing at the advertisement. "If they make A-Train fast, imagine what they'll do for my game," his friend laughed. "Bro, you know that's just marketing bullshit, right?" "Nah, man, these are legit. The 7 don't fuck around with fake products." Nolan continued his aerial survey, noting similar conversations repeating across multiple city blocks. Every exchange revealed the same pattern of uncritical worship disguised as consumer enthusiasm. These people had confused corporate branding with genuine capability marketing materials with evidence of strength. A promotional video dominated one of the larger screens, showing a female figure in white and gold, generating light from her hands. The caption identified her as Starlight, accompanied by text announcing her departure from the 7 and her current activism work. "Starlight's so brave," a woman said to her group, all of them watching the screen. "Speaking out against Vought like that takes real courage. Girl's got a target on her back now," another replied. "But at least she's being real, you know? Not like Homelander with his fake patriotic bullshit." "Careful," a third warned, glancing around nervously. "You know Vought's got people everywhere. They hear you talking shit about Homelander. Fuck Vought. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Banks of smaller screens showed social media feeds, thousands of accounts posting about the heroes with obsessive fervor. Trending topics included speculation about Homelander's relationship status, Debates about which Seven member would win in various hypothetical combat scenarios, discussions of their latest public appearances, not their response times to genuine threats, not their strategic effectiveness, not their actual combat capabilities. Their personal lives consumed vastly more attention than their supposed function as protectors. A news broadcast shifted to coverage of something called Vought International, the corporation managing these heroes. The reporter's voice carried the reverent tone usually reserved for discussing royalty. Vought Tower stands as a beacon of hope in Manhattan's skyline, home to the world's greatest heroes and the corporation that makes their work possible. Nolan located the structure in the distance, all glass and modern architecture designed to project power through aesthetics rather than function. The corporation's logo glowed at the summit, like a beacon marking the heart of this world's hero industry. Below him, more conversations drifted up through the urban noise. A street vendor argued with a customer about authentic Seven merchandise versus knockoffs. A tour guide explained the significance of various hero statues to a group of visitors. A street performer dressed in a crude Homelander costume posed for tips while badly imitating the hero's signature stance. Remember? The tour guide was saying, Times Square is where Homelander first revealed himself to the public. Right here on this very spot, he stopped a terrorist attack and saved hundreds of lives. The tourists took photographs documenting their proximity to manufactured legend. Nolan processed the implications with cold clarity. This world had no real defenders. The figures they celebrated couldn't stop a Viltrumite advance, couldn't resist a Thraxan invasion fleet, couldn't survive 10 seconds against a Ragnar. They were children playing dress-up, and the population had been convinced the costumes granted actual power. But that assessment raised the same question that had troubled him since arrival. Someone had pulled him through dimensional barriers. That required technology or capability far beyond what he'd observed. The disconnect suggested hidden infrastructure, concealed assets, or involvement from forces operating outside this civilization's apparent developmental level. He needed more information before making final judgment. The Viltrum Empire didn't waste resources on worlds that posed no threat and offered no value. If this planet's defenders were as weak as they appeared, it wasn't worth the effort of subjugation. But if something more dangerous lurked beneath the theatrical surface that needed to be identified and eliminated before it could become problematic. The city spread out before him in all directions, millions of lives continuing in ignorance of the predator now studying them from above. They trusted their heroes. They believed in the protection offered by figures who couldn't protect themselves. They had built an entire culture around the worship of manufactured strength. Nolan had seen this pattern before on worlds that no longer existed. Civilizations that confused spectacle with substance never survived. First contact with genuine threats. They collapsed not because they lacked potential, but because they'd invested everything in maintaining comfortable illusions rather than developing real defensive capability. This world was weak, not because it lacked individuals with abilities, but because it had turned those abilities into commodities. Power had been monetized, heroism had been branded, and the population had been conditioned to consume rather than question. They were ripe for conquest by anyone with actual capability. But conquest required purpose. Viltrum didn't waste effort on worlds that offered nothing of value. If this civilization possessed only theatrical heroes and commercial exploitation of minor superhuman variants, it warranted nothing more than observation and dismissal. Let them continue their delusion until some other threat found them. The Empire had more important concerns. Unless the dimensional anomaly had been deliberate, unless someone on this world possessed capability they were deliberately concealing. Unless this entire display of weakness was itself misdirection, Nolan needed to know which scenario he faced. And there was one way to find out. Test their defenses, not the helicopters and conventional weapons he'd already dismissed. Test the heroes themselves. See if the marketed strength matched reality. Push hard enough to reveal what actually existed beneath the propaganda and commercial branding. The Vought Tower rose in the distance, taller than the surrounding structures lit from within, by thousands of windows that suggested round-the-clock operation. The corporation's logo glowed at the summit like a beacon, marking the heart of this world's hero industry. That seemed like an appropriate place to begin his examination. Nolan stepped off the rooftop and accelerated toward the tower, leaving Times Square behind, in a gust of displaced air that sent loose papers spiraling through the intersection below. Speed built as he crossed the distance air pressure, forming a cone around him that would have torn a human body apart at these velocities. The hunt continued, and soon this world would learn what genuine power looked like. Vought Tower stood 99 stories tall, a monument to corporate ambition, wrapped in reflective glass that caught the city lights and threw them back at the sky. Nolan approached from the east at just under the speed of sound, low enough that his passage set off car alarms along 8th Avenue, but high enough to avoid the immediate notice of street-level observers. The building's profile grew larger in his vision, and he made no attempt to slow down. The initial impact point was floor 82, the executive level where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan to whoever paid enough to occupy the space. Nolan hit the glass at 400 miles per hour, and the entire panel exploded inward, structural supports torn from their moorings, as 2 tons of Viltrumite mass transferred kinetic energy into a building designed to withstand wind loads, not direct assault. The conference room, beyond, ceased to exist as a functional space. The 20-foot table, solid oak, chosen to project permanence and authority, disintegrated into splinters that embedded themselves in walls and ceiling like shrapnel. 6 executives who'd been conducting a late-night crisis meeting died before their brains could process the transition from normalcy to catastrophe. Bodies were thrown backward by the pressure wave, one man's head striking a support column hard enough to split his skull and paint the concrete with brain matter. Nolan passed through the room in less than a second, his trajectory taking him through the interior wall and into the main corridor of the PR and marketing division. Cubicles lined both sides of the hallway, each one occupied by staff, working late to manage the constant flow of hero appearances and media coverage that kept Vaught's products in the public consciousness. The displaced air from his passage picked up everything that wasn't bolted down and turned it into projectiles. Someone screamed. Then everyone was screaming. What the fuck was that? Oh God, someone call security! A woman holding a coffee cup was slammed into her monitor screen, hard enough that the glass shattered and electronics sparked against her face. The man beside her tried to duck under his desk and was caught by a filing cabinet that tumbled across the floor like dice thrown by a careless god. The shouting turned to wet, gurgling sounds as internal injuries overwhelmed the ability to vocalize. Alarms finally activated throughout the building, shrill tones overlapping with automated announcements. Structural breach detected. All personnel evacuate immediately. Nolan angled downward, passing through the floor itself, as if the reinforced concrete was paper. Rebar bent and snapped support structures groaned under sudden stress. They'd never been rated to handle. He emerged on floor 80, the financial operations level, where analysts tracked the revenue streams from licensing deals and merchandising contracts that turned superhero imagery into quarterly profits. The descent through the ceiling killed 3 people outright, bodies crushed under falling concrete slabs that weighed several hundred pounds each. A support beam torn loose from its housing swung like a pendulum through the open office space and connected with a row of desks. The metal carried enough momentum to pulverize bone. Bodies tumbled over furniture limbs, bent at angles that anatomy couldn't accommodate. Radio chatter erupted from security stations throughout the building. Nolan's enhanced hearing caught fragments of panicked coordination. All units, this is command. We have a hostile breach floor 82. Multiple casualties reported. PR division is gone. What are we dealing with here? Is this a soup? Unknown. Just get every available body up there now. Emergency protocols activated across multiple floors simultaneously. Blast doors began closing, segmenting the building into isolated sections meant to contain superhuman threats. Sprinkler systems responded to the dust and heat, releasing water that mixed with blood on the floor and created pink streams flowing toward the stairwells. People ran, some toward the exits, others frozen in place by shock that overwhelmed their survival instincts. Nolan adjusted his trajectory, targeting the floors he'd observed from outside. Crime analytics occupied levels 70 through 72. The technical heart, where Vought tracked superhuman activity across the country and coordinated responses that maintained the illusion of competent oversight. Banks of servers filled rooms, kept cold by industrial cooling systems that hummed with constant effort. He hit the server farm at the center of floor 71 like a missile. Racks of electronics exploded under the impact, circuit boards shattering, and data storage units rupturing as organized information became scattered debris. A security team burst through the entrance, weapons raised. Their leader's voice cut through the chaos with forced authority that couldn't quite mask the fear underneath. Target acquired. All units floor 71 engage on my mark. Sonic emitters online, another voice shouted from somewhere in the building. Acquiring target lock. The high-frequency weapons activated ceiling-mounted emitters designed to incapacitate superhuman threats through auditory disruption. The system had been tested on volunteers with enhanced durability subjects who'd reported severe discomfort but no lasting damage. Against someone whose physiology included atmospheric adaptation and sensory filtering refined across millennia, the weapons produced approximately the same effect as a mosquito buzzing near someone's ear. Nolan ignored the noise and continued his path of destruction. A technician who'd been running diagnostics on the network was caught between two server racks as they collapsed together. The sound he made lasted perhaps 2 seconds before compression reduced his chest cavity to pulp. Shots fired, Baz, shots fired. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions. Weapons ineffective, repeat, all weapons are ineffective. What do you mean ineffective? I mean, he's walking through 50 cal rounds like they're fucking raindrops. Cooling fluid sprayed from ruptured lines, mixing with sparks from severed power cables, to create small fires that spread across the wreckage. The sprinkler systems in this section had been disabled to protect the electronics, which meant the flames found plenty of fuel. Plastic casings melted, releasing toxic fumes that turned the air into poison. 3 floors down, researchers in the Science and Development Wing received emergency notifications. A scientist's voice cracked over the intercom system. Shut it down. Evacuate the compound V storage immediately. We can't just leave the samples. I don't give a fuck about the samples, move. Nolan descended another 2 levels, passing through floors that housed human resources and legal departments. Bodies fell past him in the central atrium as people jumped or were pushed by the panicking crowds trying to reach the stairwells. Most didn't survive the landing on the marble floor 90 feet below. Those who did wished they hadn't. Research and development occupied floors 60 through 67, the classified section, where Vought scientists studied Compound 5 and its effects on human biology. Security here was tighter reinforced walls and sealed doors meant to contain experiments that occasionally went wrong. Nolan treated the barriers as cosmetic obstacles. The first laboratory he entered held centrifuges and analysis equipment surrounding a vault containing vials of the compound itself, each one carefully labeled and stored at precise temperatures. Nolan's fist passed through the vault door titanium alloy crumpling like aluminum foil. He grabbed the storage rack inside and crushed it, glass vials shattering in his grip. Blue liquid sprayed across the room, coating surfaces and dripping onto the floor, where it pooled around the bodies of 2 scientists who'd tried to activate the emergency lockdown. One of them was still alive, barely. Blood leaked from his mouth as he tried to speak. Please, we're just scientists. The adjacent containment area held test subjects, volunteers who'd been dosed with experimental variants of the compound under observation protocols that would have horrified ethics boards if they'd known the details. Nolan demolished the observation chamber's reinforced window with a casual backhand that sent glass fragments through the neck of the lead researcher. Blood fountained from the severed carotid as the man stumbled backward, hands clutching at the wound in the universal gesture of someone trying to hold their life inside their body. "Jesus Christ!" someone screamed from the hallway. "He's in the labs. He's destroying everything." Floor 65 contained the archives, decades of research documenting successful enhancements and catastrophic failures stored in filing systems that occupied entire rooms. Nolan didn't bother reading the documents. He simply tore through the space hands, ripping apart filing cabinets and document storage until paper filled the air like snow. Some of it caught fire from sparks still drifting up from the server room demolition. The rest scattered through the building as air pressure differential pulled it toward the breaches in the outer walls. Security forces finally arrived in coordinated strength on floor 63, 12 men in tactical armor, carrying weapons that represented Vaught's best attempt at superhuman countermeasures. They formed a firing line across the corridor, and the team leader's voice carried the desperate edge of someone who knew this was likely his last stand. "All weapons maximum firepower. Do not let that thing get past us." They opened up with everything they had: armor-piercing rounds, incendiary ammunition, electrical nets designed to disable nervous systems. The barrage created a wall of noise and fury that accomplished nothing except announcing their position. Nolan walked through the gunfire like someone strolling through rain. Bullets flattened against his costume or ricocheted into walls, one round striking a fire extinguisher and releasing foam that sprayed across the hallway. The electrical net wrapped around his torso and delivered enough voltage to stop a human heart. He flexed his shoulders, and the cables snapped. The team's discipline broke. Half of them retreated, boots pounding on tile as they ran for the stairwells, while shouting into radios that no longer worked because the communications infrastructure had been housed in the server farm. "Fall back, fall back." "Oh fuck, oh Jesus fuck, he's coming right at us." The transmission ended in a wet crunch. The other half stood their ground, reloading, and continuing to fire with the desperate courage of people who knew they were dead, but refused to accept it passively. Nolan reached the nearest man and placed one hand on his chest. The push wasn't hard, just firm enough to send the body backward at roughly 60 miles per hour. The man hit the far wall and came apart, armor unable to contain the sudden deceleration of organs and skeleton. What remained slid down to leave a smear that stretched from ceiling to floor. The others died faster, Nolan moving through their formation with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected violence across centuries. Necks snapped, helmets crumpled, bodies tumbled through the already damaged walls and fell into open spaces below. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds. Nolan descended to floor 60, where additional research teams had barricaded themselves in a reinforced testing chamber. The door was rated to contain explosive decompression and could theoretically withstand direct hits from anti-tank weaponry. Nolan placed both hands against the surface and pulled. Metal screamed as the door tore free hinges and locking mechanisms ripping out of the wall. He tossed it aside and stepped into the chamber. 9 people huddled in the far corner, some holding improvised weapons that ranged from fire extinguishers to a chair leg. Their faces showed the progression of fear from shock to terror to resignation as they recognized that nothing they could do would matter. Nolan evaluated them with the same clinical detachment he'd applied to every other obstacle and concluded they posed no threat. No, he left them alive. Not out of mercy, but because killing them served no tactical purpose. They would tell others what they'd witnessed. Spread the story of how easily their defenses had failed. Fear was sometimes more useful than corpses. The central support structure of the tower groaned as stress from the damage accumulated beyond design tolerances. Nolan had created multiple breaches in the building's skeleton, removing load-bearing elements and compromising the distribution of forces that kept the structure stable. The tower wasn't collapsing yet, but the engineers who'd designed it would have evacuated immediately if they'd seen the current state of its internal supports. Nolan rose through the center of the building, passing through floors he'd already damaged and adding new destruction where opportunities presented themselves. A water main ruptured and flooded 3 levels. Gas lines broke and filled spaces with explosive vapor. Electrical systems short-circuited and started fires in areas the sprinklers couldn't reach. He emerged onto the roof, stepping out into open air through a penthouse suite that had housed Vought's executive leadership. The furniture here cost more than most people earned in years: leather and imported wood arranged to convey power and permanence. Nolan had reduced it all to kindling on his way through. The city spread out below, emergency vehicles converging on the tower with sirens that sounded like the collective wailing of a species finally understanding its vulnerability. News helicopters circled at what their pilots probably thought was a safe distance, cameras capturing footage that would dominate every channel within minutes. Behind him, Vought Tower burned and bled and slowly began the process of dying. The corporation's heart had been torn out, its infrastructure reduced to wreckage. Its carefully maintained image of control shattered along with the glass and concrete. Hundreds were dead or injured, billions in assets destroyed, and the hero industry's central pillar had been revealed as fundamentally fragile. Nolan waited on the roof cape, lifting slightly in the wind, and prepared for whatever response this world could muster. The test had begun. The sound reached him first. A disturbance in air pressure that suggested something approaching fast. Nolan turned from his observation of the burning tower to face the incoming presence, posture, relaxed hands at his sides. Whatever this world planned to throw at him next, he was ready. Homelander landed on the rooftop with theatrical precision, boots touching down on scorched concrete, while his cape settled dramatically around his shoulders. The costume looked exactly as it had on the billboards, red and blue and white, arranged in patterns meant to evoke patriotic symbolism. Up close, the material showed signs of wear around the edges. Small imperfections in the stitching that mass production couldn't entirely eliminate. The face beneath the styled hair carried an expression Nolan recognized from 1,000 worlds. Narcissistic certainty. The look of someone who'd never encountered genuine resistance and had mistaken that absence for invincibility. Blue eyes swept across the destruction, processing the bodies and fires, and structural damage then locked onto Nolan with an intensity meant to intimidate. Homelander's jaw clenched. His chest expanded with a breath held too long, the physical tell of someone preparing to speak and discovering the words weren't coming as easily as planned. One hand moved to his belt fingers, brushing against something tucked into a hidden pocket. The gesture was unconscious, automatic, the way a child might touch a security blanket when entering an unfamiliar situation. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" The words came out with practiced theatrical fury, the kind of anger performed for cameras rather than genuinely felt. Homelander took a step forward, cape billowing behind him in wind that seemed timed to his movement. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm the Homelander. I'm the world's greatest superhero." His voice climbed in volume with each sentence. "I've saved more lives than you can count. I've stopped terrorists, defeated armies, protected this country from every threat imaginable." He gestured at the burning building behind him. The motion exaggerated, like he was projecting to an audience in the back row. "This tower, these people, they're under my protection. Mine. And you just..." His voice cracked slightly, the first hairline fracture in the performance. "You can't just come here and do whatever you want. That's not how this works." Nolan stood still, expression neutral, and let the monologue continue. Analysis required observation. This figure clearly needed to establish verbal dominance before attempting physical confrontation. Standard behavior for someone whose power derived partly from psychological intimidation of weaker opponents. I can do whatever the fuck I want. Homelander continued, regaining some of his theatrical confidence. Whatever the fuck I want. Do you understand that I'm a god compared to these people? I'm the strongest man in the world. I've never been hurt, never been beaten, never even been challenged. His hand completed the motion. It had started pulling a small bottle from the concealed pocket. The container was plastic, decorated with pastoral imagery of cows and farms. The kind of receptacle that held milk in individual serving sizes. The contents inside sloshed as Homelander's grip tightened, knuckles going white around the bottle's neck. He seemed to realize what he'd done and quickly tucked it back into the pocket face, flushing with embarrassment that he tried to mask his rage. "You're going to regret this," he said, voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing growl. "Nobody does this to me. Nobody. I'm going to make an example out of you. The whole world is going to watch what happens when someone tries to..." Red light bloomed in his eyes, twin points of energy that built to visible intensity. The heat vision lanced out two beams of concentrated thermal radiation that could cut through steel, designed by whatever process had created this world's enhanced individuals to be an ultimate weapon against conventional targets. Nolan stood still and let the beams strike his face. The energy washed over Viltrumite's skin and dissipated into waste heat, no more effective than pointing a flashlight at a mirror. Molecular bonds that had evolved to withstand re-entry friction and survive in stellar coronas weren't going to be disrupted by what amounted to focused infrared. Nolan's eyes didn't even blink against the glare. The beams cut off abruptly. Homelander's expression shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions, each one visible for perhaps half a second before being replaced by the next. Confusion. Disbelief. The first tremor of genuine fear cracking through the armor of manufactured confidence. "No." The word came out quiet, almost a whisper. No, that's impossible." His voice climbed in pitch, the careful theatrical modulation, abandoned for something approaching genuine panic. "You can't. My eyes are the strongest thing on this planet. I've cut through planes, through reinforced steel, through..." He stopped himself, seemed to realize he was rambling. "What the fuck are you?" The bottle slipped from his pocket completely this time, hitting the rooftop and rolling away. White liquid leaked from the cap, spreading across concrete, still warm from fires burning in the floors below. Homelander's eyes tracked the bottle's movement with the intensity of someone watching their last anchor to sanity escape. "I'm supposed to be the marketing," said Vought. "Promised I was..." Then instinct overrode the fragmenting cognition, and he lunged forward, covering the 60 feet between them in a burst of speed that would have impressed most observers. Against Nolan, it moved with the relative velocity of someone running in waist-deep water. Nolan waited until Homelander's fist was perhaps 6 inches from his face, then displaced himself 3 feet to the left. The movement took no visible effort, no wind-up or preparation. Just instantaneous relocation from one point in space to another. Homelander's momentum carried him through the space Nolan had occupied, off-balance posture exposed. The counterstrike was clinical. Nolan's fist connected with Homelander's solar plexus with exactly enough force to demonstrate the gap between them. Not his full strength, which would have reduced the body to component atoms. Just sufficient power to send Homelander backward at roughly supersonic velocity. The impact made a sound like thunder, compressed into a single syllable. Homelander became a projectile, crossing the distance to the neighboring building in a quarter second and hitting the glass facade with enough force to spiderweb cracks across 50 feet of surface area. The window shattered, and he continued through, disappearing into the interior of what real estate records would identify as a luxury apartment complex. The trajectory took him through someone's living room, pulverizing a wall-mounted television and reducing a couch to fragments, then through the interior wall into a bedroom where a couple had been trying to sleep through the chaos outside. They had perhaps 3/4 of a second to register the costumed figure tumbling through their space before he demolished the opposite wall and continued into the next apartment. Homelander passed through 3 more residences, each impact slowing his velocity by roughly 20% before the momentum finally dissipated enough that he crashed to a stop in what appeared to be a bathroom. Tile shattered. The toilet exploded under his weight. Pipes ruptured, and water began spraying from severed connections. On Vought Tower's roof, Nolan walked to the edge and looked across the gap at the trail of destruction. Dust and debris leaked from the holes Homelander had carved through the building. Somewhere in that wreckage, the figure who'd been marketed as this world's greatest protector was experiencing pain and confusion in quantities his psychology had no framework to process. The milk bottle lay on its side near Nolan's feet, contents mostly spilled, but a few drops still clinging to the interior. He picked it up, examining the pastoral imagery with clinical interest. The branding suggested comfort maternal care, the kind of primal associations humans formed with early nurturing. That Homelander carried this object into combat revealed more about his psychological construction than any amount of surveillance could have provided. This world's greatest hero was a child in an adult's body, someone who'd been given power without wisdom and capability, without genuine challenge. The milk represented everything he'd been denied in whatever laboratory had produced him. Safety, care, the unconditional acceptance that organic development normally provided. And Nolan had just demonstrated in terms that couldn't be rationalized away that none of that mattered against actual strength. He set the bottle down carefully and turned his attention back to the burning tower. Somewhere below, people were dying from injuries and smoke inhalation. Rescue workers struggled to reach the upper floors where survivors huddled in isolated pockets. The building's structural integrity continued to degrade as fires spread and support columns failed under redistributed loads. None of that concerned him. This was a test, and the test was revealing exactly what he'd suspected. This world's defenders were theatrical performers, playing at warfare with abilities that might intimidate baseline humans, but collapsed instantly against genuine force. Across the Gap movement suggested Homelander was extricating himself from the rubble. The figure that eventually emerged from the damaged building looked substantially less composed than the one who'd landed so dramatically minutes earlier. The costume bore tears and scorch marks. Blood leaked from his nose and one ear. His flight pattern as he lifted into the air showed the wobble of someone whose equilibrium had been severely compromised, but he was still mobile. Still capable of continuing the engagement if pride and programming demanded it. Nolan calculated the odds of Homelander actually returning for another exchange versus retreating to process what had happened to his self-image. The answer came quickly. Homelander turned away from Vought Tower and accelerated into the distance trajectory, suggesting he was fleeing rather than regrouping. The speed was impressive by local standards, perhaps approaching 800 miles per hour, but Nolan could have caught him with trivial effort. He chose not to. Pursuing a broken opponent served no purpose. The damage to Homelander's psychology was already complete. Let him run. Let him hide. Let him try to reconcile the collision between his marketed image and the reality of his limitations. The test had provided useful data. This world's premier defender couldn't withstand a single casual blow. His supposedly ultimate weapon couldn't mark Viltrumite's skin. His speed and strength were adequate for managing civilian populations, but useless in actual combat against someone who'd trained for warfare rather than publicity. If Homelander represented the peak of this world's capability, the rest would fall even faster. Nolan looked down at the milk bottle one final time, then crushed it in his fist. Plastic crumpled, and the remaining liquid sprayed across the rooftop white drops, mixing with soot and ash. The symbolism was obvious enough that even the most obtuse observer would understand the message. Whatever comfort this world's heroes derived from their illusions, those illusions were now exposed as fundamentally hollow. The bottle that Homelander had clutched like a talisman couldn't protect him. The power that had been marketed as absolute had proven worthless. The god had encountered something beyond his comprehension and discovered he'd never been divine at all. Below, emergency broadcasts would be spreading news of the tower assault across every media platform. Cameras had captured Homelander's arrival and rapid departure. Social media would be analyzing every second of footage, trying to explain how their greatest hero had fled from an unknown threat. The narrative they'd relied on was breaking. The infrastructure they'd trusted was burning. And Nolan had barely begun the examination. He stepped off the rooftop and descended toward the lower floors, where other defenders would surely be mobilizing. If this world possessed any genuine capability, now would be the time for them to reveal it. If not, this test would conclude quickly, and he could focus on finding whoever had pulled him through the dimensional barrier. Either way, the answer was approaching, and Nolan would meet it with the same patient certainty that had defined Viltrumite expansion across 10,000 worlds. The hunt continued. The emergency broadcast reached every 7-member, simultaneously transmitted through implants that Vought had installed for precisely this kind of crisis coordination. The message was simple and carried the unmistakable edge of institutional panic. All 7 members report to Vought Tower immediately. This is not a drill. Lethal force authorized. Repeat, lethal force is authorized. The voice belonged to someone high enough in the command structure to make that authorization meaningful, which told Nolan everything he needed to know about how thoroughly he'd compromised their defensive infrastructure. They were throwing everything at him now. The theatrical heroes who'd been marketed as invincible, brought together in a desperate attempt to stop what they couldn't begin to understand. He waited on the penthouse level, surrounded by the ruins of executive luxury, and prepared to see if numbers would make any difference against fundamental disparity in capability. They arrived within 2 minutes, converging on the tower from different positions across the city. A-Train was first covering the distance at speeds that would have been impressive if Nolan hadn't spent millennia moving at velocities that made sound itself seem stationary. The figure in dark colors with red lightning accents burst through the already shattered windows and skidded to a halt on the debris-covered floor. Holy shit. A-Train took in the destruction with eyes that couldn't quite process the scale of damage. What the fuck happened here? He spotted Nolan standing amid the wreckage, and his entire posture shifted, body coiling into the stance of someone preparing to run. The confidence that had carried him through marketing campaigns and staged rescues evaporated when confronted with genuine threat. Yo, I don't know who you are, but you picked the wrong fucking building to mess with. The words came out with bravado that his body language contradicted. A-Train was already calculating escape routes, weight shifting toward the nearest exit even as he talked. I'm the fastest man alive. Faster than sound. Faster than light, maybe. You can't touch me. Nobody can touch. He blurred into motion, attempting to circle around Nolan at speeds that left after-images in his wake. The strategy was sound for someone whose primary advantage was velocity. Create confusion through rapid repositioning strike from unexpected angles. Never remain stationary long enough for counterattack. Against Nolan, it was the equivalent of a child running circles around an adult and expecting that to present a tactical challenge. Nolan's hand shot out and closed around A-Train's ankle mid-stride. The speedster had been traveling at approximately Mach 2 when the grip arrested his momentum and the laws of physics expressed their opinion on sudden deceleration with brutal clarity. A-Train's legs separated from his body at the hip bone and muscle and connective tissue, unable to withstand forces they'd never evolved to handle. The scream that followed was high-pitched and breaking the sound of someone experiencing pain that exceeded their neurological capacity to process. A-Train tumbled across the floor momentum, still carrying his body forward, even as blood sprayed from the catastrophic wound. He came to rest against a support column, hands clutching at the place where his leg used to be, fingers slipping in his own blood. Oh God, my leg. Oh fuck, my fucking leg. The words dissolved into incoherent sobbing. A-Train tried to activate his speed again, some desperate instinct telling him that movement meant survival. But the attempt only resulted in his remaining legs spasming uselessly. He looked up at Nolan with eyes that contained nothing but animal terror and the gradual realization that he was going to die. The realization came true approximately 8 seconds later when blood loss shut down his brain. The next arrival was Firecracker bursting through the entrance with explosive rounds already launching from her modified weapons. The costume bore obvious design influences from American military aesthetic stars and stripes arranged in patterns that suggested patriotic fervor curated by a marketing department. You picked the wrong country to fuck with, asshole. She fired continuously ordnance designed to incapacitate superhuman threats through overwhelming explosive force. Each round detonated against Nolan's chest or face, creating fireballs that momentarily obscured him from view. The bombardment would have been sufficient to level a small building, reduce conventional armor, to slag-turn human bodies into pink mist. Nolan walked through it like someone strolling through light rain. America's sweetheart is gonna shove these rockets up your commie ass. Firecracker's voice climbed in pitch as her weapons proved useless. Come on, you son of a bitch, fight back. The desperation in her voice suggested that she understood the problem, but couldn't accept it. Her entire identity was built around being strong, being capable, being the female hero who didn't need rescue. Confronting evidence that contradicted that narrative meant confronting the possibility that her entire life had been built on manufactured lies. Nolan closed the distance in a single step and caught one of her rockets mid-flight, rotating it in his grip to point back at its source. Firecracker's eyes went wide as she recognized what was about to happen. Wait, no, that's not... The rocket detonated at point-blank range. The explosion vaporized her head and upper torso, leaving only legs and lower abdomen to collapse onto the floor in a spreading pool of blood and viscera. The smell of cooked meat mixed with chemical propellant filled the space. Sister Sage arrived, while the smoke was still clearing, flanked by Black Noir 2 and the Deep. She took in the scene with analytical precision that most of the others had lacked, eyes moving from A-Train's corpse to Firecracker's remains to Nolan himself. Her expression suggested she was processing tactical data and running probability calculations, calculating optimal attack vector based on observed capabilities, she said, voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone treating combat as a mathematics problem. Subject demonstrates complete immunity to kinetic and thermal attacks. Speed suggests reaction time measured in microseconds. Physical strength sufficient to dismember enhanced durability subjects. She was talking to herself or to her team, working through the analysis out loud, the way some intellectuals did when processing complex problems. Probability of successful engagement through conventional means, effectively 0. Recommend immediate evacuation and strategic. Nolan moved. Sister Sage's analytical capabilities were impressive by human standards, but they operated at human processing speeds. She managed to track his approach for perhaps 1/10 of a second before his hand closed around her skull. He'll move left in 0.3 seconds based on previous. The prediction cut off as Nolan applied pressure. Sister Sage's skull crumpled like an aluminum can, the sound of breaking bone briefly audible, before brain matter squeezed out between his fingers. Her body went instantly limp, all that processing power shut down before it could complete the thought that might have saved her. Black Noir 2 moved with the trained efficiency of someone who'd practiced combat extensively, but never faced genuine life-or-death stakes. He came in low, dual blades, attempting to find gaps in Nolan's defenses, targeting joints and soft tissue with the precision of someone who'd studied anatomy. The knives shattered against Viltrumite skin. Noir tried to pivot to grappling techniques, attempted to apply leverage that might work against enhanced human physiology. Nolan grabbed his head with both hands and twisted. The crack was sharp and final vertebrae separating with the sound of breaking wood. Noir's body dropped. The mask hid whatever expression might have crossed his face in that final moment. But the way his hands clutched at nothing suggested he'd understood what was happening right at the end. The Deep stood frozen, eyes moving between the corpses accumulating around Nolan, like offerings at an altar of violence. His costume was soaking wet, suggesting he'd come directly from water, and his hands trembled as they reached for weapons he didn't actually carry. I'm one of the 7, you can't... His voice cracked. We're the most powerful heroes in the world. We've fought aliens and terrorists, and... The Deep seemed to realize mid-sentence how hollow the words sounded when confronted with bodies that used to be his teammates. He took a step backward, then another, the fight-or-flight response finally coming down firmly on the side of flight. Oh God, oh God, oh God, please! He turned and ran for the window, probably intending to reach water where his abilities might give him some advantage. Nolan crossed the distance and caught him by the waist. The Deep's enhanced physiology made him more durable than baseline humans, capable of withstanding deep ocean pressures and surviving impacts that would kill ordinary people. Against someone who could survive re-entry and fight in stellar coronas, that durability was meaningless. Nolan pulled in opposite directions. The Deep's body resisted for perhaps half a second, enhanced tissue straining against forces it was never designed to withstand. Then physics won, and he separated at the waist, upper and lower body, coming apart with the wet, tearing sound of overstressed meat. I don't want to die. I don't want to... The words cut off as shock and blood loss shut down his brain. Internal organs spilled onto the floor in ropey coils, still steaming in the cool air flowing through the broken windows. Silence fell across the penthouse level. 5 bodies lay scattered across debris that had once been executive furniture, each one representing what this world had marketed as peak human achievement. A-Train, who could run faster than sound. Firecracker, whose weapons could level buildings. Sister Sage, whose intellect supposedly exceeded human limits. Black Noir 2, trained to be the perfect infiltration asset. The Deep adapted to survive the crushing pressure of oceanic depths, all of them dead within 90 seconds of engagement. None of them had made Nolan exert more effort than required to cross a room at walking pace. This was what passed for protection on this world. These theatrical performers, with their branded costumes and their corporate-approved heroism, none of them had ever faced genuine combat. They'd been given just enough power to be impressive to baseline humans, while being kept weak enough to control, and the result was this massacre. Nolan walked through the blood pooling on the floor and looked out over the city through the windows that Firecracker's explosions had shattered completely. Somewhere below, the remaining defenders of this world were receiving reports about what had just happened. They would be processing the information that their greatest heroes had been eliminated faster than it took to brew coffee. Soon they would send whatever else they thought might work. More conventional weapons, different strategies, perhaps even something unexpected that might actually present a challenge. Nolan waited for it with patient certainty, standing amid the corpses of heroes who'd believed their marketing materials and prepared to demonstrate again what real power looked like. The test continued. The CIA had exactly one asset left that qualified as weapons-grade, superhuman capability, and the decision to deploy him came from high enough in the chain of command that nobody questioned whether it was wise. They were past wisdom now, operating in the territory of desperation, where bad options were weighed against worse ones. Somewhere in a bunker beneath Virginia, encrypted communications crackled with the kind of tension that preceded irreversible decisions. Asset Soldier Boy is green for deployment. Authorization codes confirmed. Roger that. Asset is mobile. ETA to target zone 4 minutes. All civilian evacuation protocols are active. We're clearing a 6-block radius. Sir, what about collateral damage? A pause, then at this point acceptable. Just stop that thing. The transport helicopter came in low over the Hudson, running dark except for required navigation lights. Inside the cargo bay, strapped into restraints that could theoretically contain a detonation equivalent to a small tactical nuke, Benjamin sat with the patience of someone who'd spent decades in cryogenic storage and found waiting trivial by comparison. He'd been briefed during the flight, fed information about the target through headphones that outlined capabilities and threat assessment with clinical efficiency. Enhanced durability, extreme strength, complete immunity to conventional weapons, responsible for the elimination of the 7 and hundreds of civilian casualties. None of it concerned him. Benjamin had fought in wars that these analysts couldn't imagine killed threats that made their worst nightmares look like children's bedtime stories. One more superhuman asshole with delusions of invincibility was just another Tuesday for someone who'd spent the Cold War putting down enhanced Soviet assets. The helicopter's crew chief signaled 2 minutes to drop. Benjamin stood stretched muscles that had been frozen for years and checked his gear with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this so many times, the motions were encoded in muscle memory. "You ready for this, soldier boy?" the crew chief had to shout over the rotor noise. Benjamin flashed a grin that had once graced recruitment posters and propaganda films. "Son, I've been ready since before you were born." The helicopter doors opened, and he dropped through darkness toward the burning tower below. Wind resistance barely registered as he descended, body-oriented to land with maximum dramatic impact. The roof rushed up to meet him, and he hit it with force, calculated to announce his arrival. Concrete cracking under boots that had stomped through everything from Nazi bunkers to Middle Eastern insurgent strongholds. Nolan turned from his observation of the bodies littering the penthouse level. This new arrival wore different colors than the other's costume design, suggesting an earlier era's aesthetics. The figure stood with the posture of someone who'd seen actual combat weight, distributed in ways that spoke to genuine training, rather than choreographed performance. "You picked the wrong fucking decade to start shit, pal." The voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd spent years shouting over explosions and gunfire. Soldier Boy rolled his shoulders, joints popping audibly, then pointed one finger at Nolan with theatrical flourish. "Let me give you some free advice from an old pro. I've killed commies, Nazis, terrorists, and every other flavor of asshole that thought they could fuck with America. You know what they all had in common?" He paused as if waiting for an answer, then continued when none came. "They all died badly. So here's your chance to walk away. Turn around, go back to whatever shithole country you crawled out of, and maybe you live to see tomorrow." Nolan analyzed the figure with clinical interest. The physiology showed genuine enhancement rather than the theatrical capabilities the others had possessed. This one had durability that went deeper than skin-level invulnerability, cellular reinforcement that suggested legitimate battlefield application. The confidence wasn't manufactured bravado. This soldier had actually fought and won enough times to believe his own legend, which made him marginally more interesting than the others, if equally doomed. "No." "That's what I figured." Soldier Boy cracked his knuckles and settled into a fighting stance. "All right then. Let me show you how a real hero handles business." Energy began building in his chest, visible through the costume as orange-white light that pulsed with increasing intensity. The radiation signature was distinctive, a modified nuclear reaction contained within enhanced tissue. The power output climbed steadily toward levels that would devastate everything in a city block radius. Above the scene, helicopters carrying news crews captured footage that was being broadcast live across every major network. The cameras zoomed in on the glowing figure commentary, overlapping with the visual feed. "Bicha appears to be Soldier Boy, the legendary hero from." Energy signature consistent with his documented capabilities. Civilians are advised to evacuate immediately. The blast released with a thunderclap that shattered windows for 3 blocks in every direction. Orange-white energy exploded outward in a sphere of devastation that vaporized everything organic within 50 feet and reduced concrete to slag. The shockwave knocked helicopters sideways, cameras briefly losing their focus before stabilizing to show the aftermath. Smoke billowed from the impact zone. Fires burned where the energy had ignited flammable materials. The rooftop of Vought Tower looked like it had been hit with a bunker buster, structural supports exposed and glowing red from residual heat. In the CIA bunker, analysts watched their displays with desperate hope. Blast confirmed, city block level detonation. Thermal signature off the charts. Nothing survives that. Target status. A pause as cameras penetrated the smoke. Then quiet and defeated. Target still standing. Repeat, target is undamaged. Nolan walked out of the dissipating smoke with the same unhurried gait he'd maintained throughout the entire engagement. The blast had been impressive by local standards, genuinely capable of destroying most things on this planet. Against someone whose species had evolved to survive stellar phenomena, it was merely loud and briefly bright. Soldier Boy stared, expression shifting from confidence through confusion to something approaching respect. Well, fuck me sideways. You're tougher than you look. He rolled his neck, that same casual gesture suggesting he was just getting warmed up. All right, no more warnings. Let's dance. He charged forward with speed that exceeded baseline human capability by considerable margins, fist drawn back for a strike that carried enough kinetic energy to crater concrete. The impact connected with Nolan's jaw, and for the first time since arriving on this world, Nolan felt something that might charitably be described as pressure. Not pain, not even discomfort. Just the mild sensation of force being applied, like someone pressing a finger against his cheek with moderate firmness. Soldier Boy's expression showed surprise, then determination, then the beginning of actual concern. He struck again, combinations learned across decades of combat, each blow carrying power sufficient to reduce reinforced steel to twisted scrap. Nolan stood and absorbed the assault, using the opportunity to gather more data about this world's upper-tier capability. The conclusion came quickly. This soldier was perhaps 10 times more capable than the others had been, possessing genuine durability and strength that would make him formidable against any conventional threat. Against a Viltrumite, he was still fundamentally insufficient. Nolan caught the next punch in his palm, fingers closing around Soldier Boy's fist hard enough that bone began to creak. The soldier's other hand came up, attempting a grapple that might have worked against opponents who relied primarily on strength. Nolan used that momentum against him, pulling forward and down while driving his other fist into Soldier Boy's solar plexus. The impact sent the soldier flying backward across the rooftop, tumbling through debris until he crashed into an HVAC unit hard enough to crumple the metal housing. He extracted himself with a grunt, blood leaking from his nose, but expression still showing fight rather than fear. Okay. He spat blood and straightened up. You got hands. I respect that. The energy began building in his chest again, the second blast charging faster than the first. This was the desperation play, the trump card deployed when nothing else worked. Soldier Boy's entire body began to glow as nuclear force accumulated beyond the threshold his tissue could comfortably contain. This is just like Nicaragua, except you're the asshole getting his spine ripped out. Nolan moved before the blast could release, covering the distance, in a span of time too brief for human perception to track. His hand clamped over Soldier Boy's mouth and jaw, fingers finding purchase on bone structure as the energy within built toward critical release. The soldier's eyes went wide as he realized what was about to happen. Tried to pull away, failed because Viltrumite grip exceeded his strength by orders of magnitude. The energy had nowhere to go. Nolan's hand sealed the soldier's mouth and throat, preventing the blast from venting outward as designed. Pressure built inside the enhanced tissue, seeking release through any available channel, finding none that could accommodate nuclear force redirected inward. Soldier Boy made a sound that might have been protest or plea, hands scrabbling at Nolan's arm with decreasing coordination. Then the energy found weak points in his cellular structure, the places where enhancement met baseline humanity, and exploited them with the brutal efficiency of physics, asserting dominance over biology. The detonation was contained, but not prevented. Soldier Boy's torso expanded for perhaps 1/10 of a second as internal pressure exceeded what his tissue could withstand. then collapsed inward as the energy consumed him from inside out. The result was catastrophic organ failure, cellular structure breaking down at the molecular level, enhanced durability, meaningless when the threat came from within. Nolan maintained his grip throughout the process, using his own body to shield the surrounding area from secondary radiation. When he finally released the corpse, what remained was barely recognizable as human. The legendary soldier who'd fought across decades and continents had been reduced to something that looked like it had been microwaved from the inside. Nolan stepped back and looked down at the body. This one had been different from the others. Genuine capability, real combat experience. The kind of warrior who might have been valuable in a proper military structure. On another world, under different circumstances, this soldier might have been someone worth recruiting. On this world facing a Viltrumite, he had died like all the rest. Faster than some, maybe with more dignity than others, but dead nonetheless. In the CIA bunker, analysts watched their displays with the silence of people witnessing their worst predictions come true. The asset they'd kept frozen for emergencies, the weapon they'd saved for existential threats, the legendary hero who'd never been defeated, was gone. Used and discarded in less time than it took to complete the paperwork for his deployment. Asset is down. The words came out flat, drained of hope. Recommend immediate evacuation of all personnel. This is now a containment failure scenario. Above the tower, news helicopters maintained their distance, while cameras captured footage that would dominate coverage for weeks. The figure in white and red stood amid the wreckage of the world's defensive infrastructures, surrounded by bodies that represented every tier of capability this civilization had managed to produce. And none of it had been sufficient. Nolan looked out over the city and waited for whatever they would try next, patient and certain that the answer would be the same. This world had no defenders capable of matching genuine power. They had products marketed as heroes, soldiers given just enough enhancement to be useful without being threatening performers who'd had convinced themselves that brand recognition was equivalent to actual capability. The test was nearly complete. Soon he would have final confirmation that this world posed no threat to Viltrum's interests and could be dismissed as irrelevant to the Empire's expansion. Unless someone revealed capability beyond what he'd observed, the examination would conclude with the same verdict as countless worlds before this one. Weak, unworthy, not worth the effort of subjugation. The hunt continued, though its conclusion was becoming increasingly obvious. The boys had been watching from a rooftop 3 blocks away. Since the tower assault began positioned with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes, because Butcher didn't believe in getting caught with his pants down. They'd come looking for intelligence on Vought's response protocols, maybe a chance to exploit the chaos for their own purposes, and instead found themselves witnessing something that fundamentally redefined their understanding of power. Huey couldn't stop his hands from shaking. He'd seen Soups do terrible things, watched A-Train run through his girlfriend, and turn her into red mist, survived encounters that should have killed him a dozen times over. None of that prepared him for watching the 7 get dismantled like action figures in the hands of an angry child. We should go. His voice came out higher than intended, climbing toward panic. We should definitely go. Right now. Like right this second. Butcher didn't move from his position behind the concrete parapet, binoculars still pressed to his face. His jaw worked like he was chewing glass muscles bunching along his neck and shoulders, in the way they did when he was processing something that pissed him off beyond his capacity to immediately violence it into submission. Shut the fuck up, Huey. But Butcher, did you see what he did to A-Train? A-Train's the fastest man alive. And he just grabbed him like... I said shut the fuck up. Butcher's voice dropped to the register that meant he was thinking hard and didn't want interruption. I'm trying to figure out what the bloody hell we're looking at here. MM crouched beside them, one hand on his rifle, even though they all understood that weapons were cosmetic comfort at this point. His face had gone through shock and settled into the kind of grim calculation that came from years of military discipline. That's not a soup. MM's voice was quiet but certain. That's something else. Something way outside anything Vought ever cooked up in a lab. Frenchie sat with his back against the parapet, cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers as he stared at nothing in particular. When he spoke, the words came out in a mixture of French and English that suggested his brain was having trouble picking a language. Putain de merde. Mon Dieu. He looked at Kimiko, who was signing rapidly, her hands moving with agitated emphasis. Kimiko says he's not like us, not like Vought soups. She says, real monster. Different. Kimiko's hands continued moving her face tense with the need to communicate something her voice couldn't express. She pointed at the distant figure standing amid the wreckage, then made a gesture that suggested overwhelming force, unstoppable momentum, death made manifest. Her final sign was unmistakable, even to those who didn't speak ASL monster. Butcher lowered the binoculars and turned to look at his team expression, carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview had just been kicked in the balls by observable reality. Fucking hell. The words came out almost reverent, which was wrong coming from Butcher. He didn't do reverence. That's not a soup. That's a bloody extinction event with a cape. We need to leave, Huey insisted again, voice climbing despite MM's hand signal to keep quiet. Right now. Before whatever that thing is decides to. Campbell, shut the fuck up before he hears you. MM's military training showed through the cracks, voice dropping to command cadence. We ain't heroes. We survive. That means we stay invisible. Butcher's right for once, MM continued, eyes never leaving the distant tower. That thing just tore through the seven like they were made of wet tissue paper. Homelander ran. Homelander. The narcissistic asshole who thinks he's God just fucking ran away. Butcher made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. He reached for his flask, took a long pull, then passed it to Frenchie without comment. All this time I wanted to gut Homelander. Kill the cunt, watch him bleed, make him understand he ain't God. Turns out he's just a wanker in tights compared to that. He gestured at the tower with the flask whiskey sloshing. You see what that thing did? Not super strength? Not enhanced durability? That was something else. That was... Fuck, I don't even have words for what that was. Frenchie took the flask and drank, then offered it to Kimiko, who shook her head. Her hands moved again, rapid fire, signing that Frenchie translated with increasing distress. She says the thing moves wrong. Not like human, not like soup. Like comment did on. Like physics is different for it. Like gravity is a suggestion, not a rule. Well, that's just fucking fantastic, Huey muttered. So we're dealing with something that makes Homelander look weak. That's great. That's just perfect. How the fuck are we supposed to? We're not supposed to anything. Butcher cut him off. We're supposed to sit here, shut the fuck up, and be grateful we're not down there with the rest of the corpses. A sound from behind them made everyone turn, weapons coming up on pure reflex. Ryan stood in the stairwell entrance, face pale, and eyes wide as he took in the scene. The boy had managed to follow them, somehow tracking skills apparently inherited from his father, along with the superhuman physiology. Butcher? Ryan's voice was small, frightened. What's happening? Is my dad? Your dad's fine. Butcher said quickly, voice gentling in the way it only did for Ryan. He's not here. This is something else. Ryan moved closer to the edge, trying to see what had everyone so focused. Butcher caught his shoulder, holding him back from the parapet. Don't look, kid. Trust me on this one. But Ryan had already seen enough, his enhanced vision picking out details that normal eyes might miss. His face went somehow paler, if that was possible. Is he like my dad? The question hung in the air for several seconds while the adults tried to figure out how to answer. Finally, Butcher spoke, and his voice carried an honesty that surprised everyone, including himself. Nothing like your dad, kid. Your dad's a cunt, but he's our kind of cunt. He's Vought-made, lab-grown, product-tested. That thing. He gestured toward the tower. I don't know what that is, but it didn't come from no fucking laboratory. Kept his eyes on the distant figure, hands still resting on his rifle. Even though he understood the weapon was useless. We need to move. Now, before it decides to expand its territory. Oi, everyone, shut the fuck up and stay down! Butcher's command voice cut through the rising panic. We're ghosts. We don't exist. He don't see us. We don't die. That's simple. Huey made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Oh my God. Oh my God, we're gonna die. We're all gonna fucking die. Not if you shut your mouth and stay still, hissed. Panic later. Survive now. Kimiko touched Frenchie's arm, her hands moving in urgent signs. He watched face going from concerned to horrified. Merde. She says it is looking this direction. Everyone froze. Across the distance, the figure on the tower had turned toward their position. Even from 3 blocks away, they could feel the weight of that attention. The sensation of being observed by something that existed on a different level of the food chain. Butcher slowly, very slowly, lowered himself below the parapet. The others followed his lead, pressing against concrete that suddenly felt far too thin for cover. Nobody fucking moved, Butcher whispered. Not a goddamn muscle. They waited in silence that stretched into eternity each second, feeling like an hour, while they wondered if they'd been seen, if that thing had decided they were worth the effort of investigation. If these were their last moments before becoming another set of corpses to add to the evening's body count. After what might have been 30 seconds or 30 years, Frenchie risked a glance over the edge. It has turned away. We are not interesting enough to kill, it seems. The collective exhale was audible. Huey discovered he'd been holding his breath and now couldn't seem to get enough air hyperventilating in the way that happened after extreme adrenaline dumps. Butcher reached over and grabbed the back of Huey's neck, forcing his head down between his knees. Breathe, you muppet. In through the nose, out through the mouth. You're no good to me, passed out. Ryan sat with his back against the parapet, arms wrapped around his knees. He looked younger than his years, face showing the kind of existential terror that came from realizing the universe was far more dangerous than anyone had told you. Butcher, I'm scared. Yeah, kid, me too. Butcher's admission seemed to cost him something. Me fucking too. Spoke up from his position voice, carrying the forced calm of someone trying to maintain order through pure willpower. We extract. Now. Quiet, careful, and we don't stop until we're in the safe house, with 3 feet of concrete between us and the outside world. What about Vought? Huey asked. What about stopping them? Isn't this our chance to... Forget Vought, Butcher said flatly. Vought just got reminded they ain't shit. The 7 are dead. Homelander's running scared. And that thing up there just proved that everything we thought we knew about power was wrong. He stood slowly, keeping low, and gestured for the others to follow. We go to ground. We watch, we learn, and we stay the fuck away from whatever that is until we understand what we're dealing with. Frenchie helped Kimiko to her feet, his hands still shaking despite his attempts to appear calm. And if it comes looking for us? Butcher's grin was sharp and humorless. Then we die, mate. But at least we die knowing the truth. Homelander ain't the biggest monster in the world. He never was. He's just the one with the best marketing team. They moved toward the stairwell in formation, taking point, while Butcher covered the rear with Ryan between them. As they descended into darkness, leaving the rooftop and its view of carnage behind, Huey couldn't stop himself from asking one more question. What do we do now? Butcher paused on the stairs, looked back at his team, his family really, though he'd rather eat glass than admit it, and spoke with the certainty of someone who'd just had every plan ripped to shreds. Now, we survive. That's it. That's the whole fucking plan. We survive long enough to figure out what the hell that thing wants and pray to Christ it doesn't want us. They disappeared into the building, leaving the rooftop empty, except for cigarette butts and the ghost of their presence. Behind them, the city burned, and emergency services tried to manage a disaster they couldn't begin to comprehend. And on the tower, Nolan stood alone amid the corpses of heroes who'd believed their own legend, waiting for whatever came next, with the patience of someone who'd waited centuries and could wait centuries more. The boys had witnessed the truth. They'd seen genuine power demonstrate the difference between theatrical performance and actual capability. They'd watched their worst enemy flee in terror, and their entire understanding of the superhuman hierarchy collapse, and they'd survived. For now, that was enough. Homelander woke to pain that shouldn't have been possible. His entire existence had been built on the foundational certainty that pain was something that happened to other people, weaker people, the masses who weren't blessed with Compound 5 and Vaught's genetic engineering. The sensation of his own blood leaking from his nose and ears felt like a violation of natural law. He lay in the ruins of someone's bathroom, 3 blocks from Vought Tower, surrounded by shattered tile and twisted plumbing. Water from broken pipes sprayed across the space in irregular arcs, mixing with blood to create pink streams that flowed across white porcelain. His reflection in a cracked mirror showed someone he didn't recognize. Costume torn and scorched, face swollen and bruised in ways that marketing had promised would never happen. The sound of voices filtered through the damaged walls. Civilians gathering in the street below, phones out to document everything. Because that was what people did now. They recorded disasters broadcast, suffering turned tragedy into content for social media consumption. Homelander tried to stand and discovered his equilibrium was compromised inner ear damage, making the simple act of standing feel like navigating a ship in rough seas. He caught himself on the edge of what used to be a sink, fingers gripping porcelain, hard enough to crack it further. His hand moved to his belt, automatically, seeking the familiar shape of the bottle he'd carried since he couldn't remember when. The pocket was empty. The bottle was gone. Back on that rooftop where everything had stopped making sense, where a figure in white and red had demonstrated that Homelander's entire understanding of power was built on comfortable lies. The panic that followed wasn't the theatrical anger he performed for cameras. This was something primal. The kind of terror that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the lizard brain that knew predators when it saw them. His hands shook as they searched other pockets, patted down his costume with increasing desperation, found nothing except torn fabric and the bruises that contradicted everything Vaught's marketing had promised. No, where is it? Where the fuck did it? His voice cracked mid-sentence, the careful baritone training abandoned for something higher and breaking. He sounded young, frightened, human in ways that the brand couldn't accommodate. Through the broken wall, he could see the street below. A crowd had gathered, phones raised, recording everything. News helicopters circled at a distance, cameras zoomed in with the kind of focus that suggested they were broadcasting live. The world was watching. They'd seen him arrive at the tower with all his theatrical confidence, seen him flee like a coward. And now they were watching him crawl through rubble, looking for what? A bottle of milk. The comfort object he'd hidden from everyone, because admitting he needed it meant admitting weakness. Homelander forced himself to stand, using the wall for support. He had to get out of here. Had to find somewhere private, somewhere the cameras couldn't follow, somewhere he could process what had happened without an audience documenting his breakdown. His attempted flight was pathetic. He lifted maybe 6 feet off the ground before dizziness overwhelmed his ability to navigate 3-dimensional space, and he crashed back down on someone's fire escape hard enough to bend the metal. The structure groaned, but held, leaving him sprawled across iron grating, while dozens of phone cameras captured his failure from multiple angles. From below, voices drifted up with the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally when people felt safely distant from consequences. Holy shit, is that Homelander? Dude can't even fly straight. Look at him. This is so fucking pathetic. My hero, ladies and gentlemen. You someone get this on TikTok. Homelander eating shit is gonna go viral. Homelander's hands gripped the fire escape railing, knuckles white with pressure that would have crushed the metal if he'd had his full strength. But even that was compromised now, his invulnerability replaced with the novel sensation of bruised tissue and stressed bone. He felt breakable, mortal, human. The word repeated in his mind like an accusation. Human, weak, ordinary. Everything he was supposed to transcend everything. The marketing promised he'd left behind all of it, coming back to remind him that beneath the costume and the powers and the carefully curated image, he couldn't finish the thought. Wouldn't let himself finish it. Because if he acknowledged what he really was, if he accepted that the narrative he'd built his entire identity around was fiction, then what was left? What remained of Homelander? If you stripped away the myth, nothing. The answer came unbidden and certain. Nothing remained. He was the myth. Without it, he didn't exist. Homelander dragged himself to his feet and stumbled toward the tower. Not because he had a plan, not because he thought he could accomplish anything, but because the tower was home, in the only way he understood the concept. The place where they'd made him. The place where they'd told him he was special, important, destined for greatness. Maybe if he went back there, found the labs and the training rooms and the spaces that had shaped him, he could remember how to be what they'd promised he was. The journey took longer than it should have. He kept losing his balance, kept having to stop and brace himself against walls, while the world spun and his inner ears sent contradictory signals about which direction was up. People watched from windows and doorways, some recording, some just staring, with expressions that ranged from shock to schadenfreude. A teenager called out as he passed, "Yo, Homelander, you gonna cry? You look like you're about to cry." His friends laughed. The sound carried in the night air like knives. Homelander didn't respond. Couldn't respond. All his energy was focused on putting one foot in front of the other, maintaining forward momentum toward a destination that probably didn't matter, but was the only thing he could think to do. The tower's lower levels were chaos. Emergency responders worked to evacuate survivors. Firefighters battled blazes on multiple floors. Paramedics treated injuries that ranged from smoke inhalation to traumatic amputation. They saw Homelander approaching, and their reactions told him everything he needed to know about how thoroughly his image had been destroyed. No one asked for his help. No one called out for the hero to save them. They just watched him stumble past, with expressions that suggested they were trying to reconcile the broken figure in the torn costume with the invincible god they'd been sold. One firefighter spoke to his partner voice carrying in the relative quiet. "That's supposed to be our greatest hero. Looks like someone's dad after a bad divorce." The laughter that followed hurt worse than the punch that had sent him through buildings. Homelander reached an emergency stairwell and began climbing one hand on the railing, because he didn't trust his balance without support. Each floor was a monument to destruction, evidence of violence so far beyond his capability that trying to process it made his mind shy away from the implications. This was supposed to be his tower, his domain, the physical manifestation of his power and importance. Now it was a smoking ruin that mocked everything he'd believed about himself. He found what he was looking for on floor 67 in what remained of the R&D labs, where they'd kept backup samples of everything. The milk was there, stored in refrigeration units that had somehow survived the assault. Medical-grade formula identical to what his mother would have provided if he'd had a mother, which he hadn't. Which was the whole problem, which was why his hands shook as he pulled out a bottle. The cap came off easily, and he drank without thinking, gulping down liquid that tasted like comfort and safety and all the things he'd never actually had. It was just milk. Processed dairy product with added nutrients. But in his mouth, it became everything he needed it to be, the one constant in a world that had just revealed itself as far more dangerous than anyone had warned him. The live stream notification appeared on a monitor that still had power screen cracked but functional. Multiple angles showed him slumped against the refrigeration unit, drinking milk like a child, costume ruined and face swollen. The view counter climbed steadily, Thousands became tens of thousands, became hundreds of thousands. People were watching. The whole world was watching him break down in real time. Comments scrolled past with the speed of collective cruelty. LMAO, Homelander, drinking milk like a baby. This is the funniest shit I've ever seen. From hero to zero in one night, or IP your career. Someone make this a meme template, please. Had Homelander, week trending worldwide. Homelander set the bottle down with shaking hands and stared at the screen. At himself. At what he'd become in the space of a few hours. The carefully constructed image demolished the myth exposed as Theater the God revealed as a frightened child playing dress-up in a costume his handlers had provided. He'd spent his entire life trying to earn love through performance. Trying to become what they told him he should be. Trying to bridge the gap between the product Vought sold and the person he actually was underneath the marketing. And it had never worked. He'd never been enough. Never lived up to the image they'd created for him. But he'd been close. Close enough that he could pretend. Close enough that most days he could believe his own hype. Until tonight. Until that figure in white and red had demonstrated with casual efficiency that Homelander wasn't even close to the top of the food chain. That everything he'd built his identity around was meaningless against genuine power. The bottle lay on its side, where he'd placed it, milk leaking out to pool on the floor, white liquid mixing with blood from his nose, creating patterns that looked almost artistic in their randomness. Homelander watched it drain, watched his last comfort literally flowing away, and felt something break in his chest that had nothing to do with physical injury. He couldn't go back out there. Couldn't face the cameras and the mockery and the questions about what had happened to make him run. Couldn't maintain the performance when the audience had seen behind the curtain and found nothing but a frightened child clutching a security blanket. The rooftop seemed like the logical destination. Up there, away from the crowds and the cameras and the comments scrolling past with their casual cruelty. Up there where the air was clean and the view stretched to the horizon. And maybe, just maybe, he could think clearly enough to figure out what came next. The climb took forever. His legs barely supported him, equilibrium still compromised every step, an exercise in not falling down the stairwell. But he made it, eventually emerging onto the roof, where he'd confronted that figure and learned the truth about his own inadequacy. The milk bottle, his milk bottle, the one he'd dropped, lay in pieces near the edge. Shattered plastic and dried milk on concrete. Nolan had been here, had examined it, had probably understood exactly what it meant and found it pathetic. Homelander walked to the edge and looked out over the city. Manhattan stretched in all directions, millions of lights representing millions of lives. None of them requiring his protection because they just learned he couldn't protect anyone. Not even himself. Behind him, somewhere in the ruins below, news crews were probably still broadcasting. Analysts would be discussing what this meant for Vaught's stock price, for America's defensive infrastructure, for the entire concept of superhuman protection. None of them would be talking about the person inside the costume. They never did. He was a product, a brand, a marketing asset. The actual human underneath, assuming there was one, had never mattered to anyone except as a vehicle for the image. The bottle pieces crunched under his boots. He picked up the largest fragment, examined the pastoral imagery that was supposed to evoke comfort and maternal care. It was just plastic, just branding, just another comfortable lie in a life built on nothing else. A helicopter swung close camera zooming in. Homelander could see himself on their monitor, a broken figure on a rooftop, holding shattered plastic. The image would be everywhere within minutes. Another data point in the story of his collapse. Another piece of content for people to consume and mock and forget. He let the plastic fall. It tumbled through the air, catching light as it descended and shattered further when it hit the street 99 stories below. Gone. the last physical connection to the fiction that had sustained him through years of performance and pressure and pretending to be more than he actually was. Homelander closed his eyes and felt the wind, felt the pull of gravity suggesting how easy it would be to follow the bottle down, to end the performance permanently, to stop pretending he could be what they wanted him to be. When he opened his eyes, the city was still there, still burning in places from the assault, still full of people who'd just learned their greatest hero was a fraud, still demanding explanations he didn't have and couldn't provide. He took a step forward, then another. The edge approached with each movement concrete, giving way to empty air, 99 stories above pavement that would end him as surely as it would end anyone, without genuine invulnerability. The last thing Homelander saw was not the city he'd failed to protect, but a memory. The laboratory where they'd raised him, the scientists who'd told him he was special, the marketing executives who'd built a god from a frightened child and expected him to live up to the brand forever. He stepped off the roof with the same theatrical precision he'd used for every landing, every rescue, every carefully staged moment of heroism. But this time there was no cape billowing behind him, no cameras capturing his best angle, no crowd waiting to applaud. Just gravity, just physics asserting itself on a body that turned out to be far more breakable than the marketing had promised. Just the end of a performance that had run longer than it should have. The impact registered on seismographs as a minor tremor. News cameras captured it from multiple angles. Social media exploded with comments and memes and think pieces about what it meant that America's greatest hero had chosen this ending. But by then, Homelander was past caring what anyone thought. The performance was over. The myth was dead. And the frightened child who'd spent his entire life trying to earn love through power had finally found the one kind of peace that didn't require him to be anything except gone. Above the ruins, Nolan observed the conclusion with clinical detachment. The figure on the rooftop had made a choice that biological organisms sometimes made when psychological stress exceeded their capacity to adapt. Not particularly relevant to his assessment of the world's defensive capabilities, but confirming what he'd already determined. This world was weak. Not just physically, but structurally. They'd built their protective infrastructure on illusions and marketing, convinced themselves that branded theater was equivalent to genuine capability. The collapse was inevitable once genuine force tested their foundations. Nolan stepped off Vought Tower and ascended into the night sky. The city fell away beneath him, growing smaller, until it became just another collection of lights, indistinguishable from the thousands of other cities he'd observed across his millennia of service to the Empire. The dimensional anomaly that had brought him here would eventually repeat. The forces that had torn him from his reality would stabilize and provide passage back. Until then, he would wait. This world posed no threat to Viltrum's interests. It offered nothing worth claiming. It was simply another primitive civilization stumbling toward whatever fate awaited species that confused spectacle with strength. The hunt was over, the test complete, the answer clear. Earth was not worthy of conquest, not worth the effort of subjugation, not even worth the resources required to properly cleanse it of its delusional inhabitants. The Viltrum Empire would continue expanding through galaxies that actually mattered, claiming worlds that offered value, eliminating threats that warranted attention. This world would be left to its own devices, its theatrical heroes and corporate overlords, and comfortable illusions intact, except for the ones Nolan had shattered tonight. They would recover eventually. Humans always did. They'd build new heroes, create new myths, convince themselves that the next generation would be different. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe centuries from now they'd develop genuine capability that warranted revisiting his assessment. But Nolan wouldn't be here to see it. He'd be serving the Empire across distances these people couldn't imagine fighting wars they couldn't comprehend. expanding Viltrum's reach into territories where strength was measured by survival rather than marketing metrics. The city lights faded as he climbed toward the edge of the atmosphere. Earth rotated beneath him, oblivious to its cosmic insignificance, and Nolan left it behind without a second thought. Another world tested. Another civilization found wanting. Another confirmation that Viltrum's standards were correct. Its methods justified its expansion inevitable. The hunt continued elsewhere, always elsewhere, forever elsewhere. That was the Viltrumite way.